How to get gauge every time. Hi everyone, Norman here. Today I want to show you exactly how I get gauge and make those sweaters, those socks and hats fit like the proverbial glove. This video will hopefully revolutionize the way you look at your swatches forever, because I will do away with so many misconceptions and downright wrong information that is out there when it comes to creating fitted garments. Let's dive right into it. If you ask me, getting gauge is an illusion, a little bit like those 5-minute crafts that never work. So that's why I prepared a couple of swatches and a couple of tools here to show you exactly why you can never get gauge. First issue, so I have a little swatch here in stockinette stitch in front of me, and let's just measure 5 centimeters so we can find out the gauge. So here, this is a V of a stitch. This column here aligns perfectly with the 0. So 5 centimeters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then here 5 centimeter, 9.5. Now let me ask you the following question. When did you last see a pattern where gauge was supplied in fractional stitches? I'll answer that for you, never. So there is always that little section and it tells you like 10, 20, 30 stitches or rows neatly fit into a little square like this one here. So instead of 9.5 stitches, I probably would have measured 10 stitches that fit into my 5 times 5 gauge square. The difference between 9.5 and 10, 5%. That's already more than a full size, just due to a simple rounding issue you or the designer or both of you may have made. So typically you block your swatch before measuring, and I have 2 swatches here in front of me, both identical. 10 stitches wide and 10 rows high. Now I'm going to block them differently. So for the first swatch here, I'm going to start in the middle and stretch it out vertically as much as possible. And then from there, I'm going to continue stretching out vertically as much as possible. Now, if you do it like that, you will quickly notice that this severely limits the amount you can stretch this swatch here horizontally. All the stretch went into the vertical dimension. Now here for the second swatch, I'm going to do the exact opposite. So I'm going to stretch this out as far as possible horizontally. So I'm going to stretch this out as far as possible here horizontally. And then this here will be the result. Remember, the exact same swatches, 10 stitches wide, 10 stitches high, same bind off, same cast on. So let's measure our gauge here. So 5 centimeters, I don't know how well you can see this, 5 centimeters is here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 stitches, whereas this swatch here is barely 5 centimeters wide, so maybe 9.5 stitches. And the difference between 5.5 and 9.5 stitches, well, that's almost 50%. 50% of a difference just because you block differently. Now, of course, this was an extreme example. Still, if you block your swatch a little bit too far horizontally, then the strand between the stitches will get longer, whereas if you stretch your swatch a little bit too much vertically, the strand here will get shorter and the stitches longer, and both will alter your gauge, and it will, as you can see, alter it permanently. I have this little gauge tool here in front of me, and it's 10 centimeters wide. Now let me ask you, how many inches are 10 centimeters? 4 inches? No. 10 centimeters are actually 3.93 inches. And the difference between 4 and 3.93 inches, well, that's already 1.75%. 1.75% of a difference just because the designer told you to measure 10 centimeters or 4 inches and not specifically one of them. Now let's measure this gauge too. So it's supposed to be 10 centimeters wide, but it turns out it actually isn't. So it's 9.96 centimeters wide. And here is another gauge tool. And if I measure that, this is 10.9 centimeters. Now, these deviations are minor, but it's very important to understand that these differences stack upon each other. Here's the fifth issue. So how much do you think the designer stretched this swatch while blocking? This much, or maybe this much? I'll tell you, we do not know. So here, this swatch, I can stretch it horizontally round about until it's 9 centimeters wide. If I stretch it till it's 7 centimeters wide while blocking, and assuming it stays put, that means there's round about 20% negative ease remaining in the fabric. So this distance here, that's what's remaining in the fabric. However, I could also block it to only 6 centimeters, then there would be 30% of negative ease remaining. Again, let me ask you, will your fitted sock or your fitted sweater pattern that relies on negative ease work out, or will you look like a head cheese? I'll answer that for you as well. We simply do not know. If you are wondering why you can never get gauge, think again. It's not you, but it's you working without specific and well-defined parameters. On your way to knit a swatch like this one here, just so much can go wrong because you are left guessing. So we have our problems staked out for us. Let's solve them together. So if you take a look at any professional pattern, there are typically 4 bits of information. A, the gauge. So there should be a bit where it says a 10 by 10 centimeter swatch or 4 by 4 inches swatch has that many stitches and that many rows. It should also list a pattern for the swatch. Typically it's stockinette stitch or garter stitch. That's the goal and the goal of this video. Then the pattern should list the exact yarn. So the name of the exact yarn the designer used. You need to know whether it's sheep wool, alpaca, or a blend, and of course the yardage, say 50 grams are 100 meters. Then you also need the exact measurements or schematics for the pattern. So you need things like the bust circumference, sleeve length, head circumference, shoe size, etc. And then of course the needle size the designer used to knit their sample. If any of these bits of information are missing, then I would consider skipping the pattern because getting gauge will be almost impossible. Step number 1, yarn substitution. So getting gauge is not only about hitting numbers. It's foremost about creating the same fabric and specifically not just about getting the same stitch count. There are worlds in between these two things. So in the first step, you need to find a yarn that has almost the exact same characteristics. So if you ask me, the easiest way to achieve this is visiting yarnsub.com. That's yarnsub.com. Simply enter the name of your yarn and it will spit out a couple of alternatives with the same characteristics. So you are looking for something with the same fiber composition, the same yardage, and the same spinning method. So if the designer uses 100% sheep wool, then try to use 100% sheep wool as well. If the designer uses an 8-ply yarn, then pick an 8-ply yarn. If it's 50 grams per 100 meters, then pick something similar. Really, this is no rocket science. The label of each yarn literally spells out these details and you just need to match them as close as possible. That's all you really need to do. This step is possibly the most important one, and if you make any mistakes here, it may be impossible for you to get gauge. That is how important it is. Let's take a look at a couple of very, very interesting facts. So first of all, two different yarns may have the exact same yardage, meaning 50 grams or 100 meters, but one might be thicker and one might be thinner. Typically, this is at the most extreme between different fibers. Say one is a cotton yarn and the other one is a sheep wool yarn. So I have two skeins of yarn here in front of me. This is the Schachmeier Catania, 100% cotton, and here it says 50 grams is 125 meters. And here we have a nice Pasquale yarn. Here it says it's 70% virgin wool and 30% yak. And again, the yardage is 50 grams is 125 meters. Now, you don't really need to be a rocket scientist to see just how much thinner this cotton yarn is, despite having the same yardage. Now here comes the important bit. So when I knit a stitch, no matter how tight I pull, no matter how I can pull as tight as I want, that stitch is always going to be as high as the diameter of your knitting needle plus the diameter of your yarn. So that is the minimum height of your stitch. But what does this actually mean? So let's suppose you and the designer, you are both using 3 millimeter needles to knit your swatch. However, the designer's yarn is 3 millimeters thick. And because you are allergic to wool, want a vegan alternative, you are using cotton yarn, and your yarn is only 2 millimeters thick. So let's check what the difference in gauge will be. So the designer's stitches will be at least 6 millimeters high. So 3 for the yarn, 3 for the needles, whereas your stitches will be at least 5 millimeters high. So if you were to knit a swatch and then, take a ruler and measure your row gauge, and let's suppose you are measuring 10 centimeter, then the designer would record 16.6 rows, whereas you would record 20 rows. Almost 4 stitches of a difference, and we can come back to fractional stitches. Would the designer have recorded 17 or 16 stitches? Well, we don't know. So it could be 3 or 4 rows of a difference, just because you are using a different yarn with the same yardage. And this is very, very important, because if you want to achieve or get the gauge of the designer, this means you would have to go up 2 needle sizes. So you wouldn't have to go only up to 3.5 millimeters, but you would have to go to 4 millimeters, because only 4 millimeters plus 2 millimeters would result in the same minimum row gauge, However, prior to blocking and distorting your fabric through pulling and stretching, your stitch gauge, so this gauge here, this horizontal gauge here, is mostly defined by the thickness of your yarn and how loose or tight you knit. So after I knit a stitch, I pull tight. And if we zoom in, no matter how tight I pull, the distance between these two stitches is mostly defined by these two legs. So this left leg here of the previous stitch 1 row below, and the right leg of the stitch 1 row below. They sort of act as a buffer between these two stitches, and no matter how tight I pull, I won't be able to close the gap further. So if you take a look, you are creating that little bridge here, this little purl bump, this little bridge. And this bridge here will always be as long as your yarn is wide, plus here these two legs here. So it will always, the distance between the stitches will be always 3 times your yarn. However, if you pull tight, you can sort of squish your yarn together. So you can always squish that. So mostly it's very, very easy, typically you can calculate that your stitches are twice as wide as your yarn is thick. It is very, very important to note that these factors will not change with your knitting needle size. So I went down to 2mm needles here instead of 4mm needles, and then I knit a stitch and then I pulled tight. However, the distance here between these two stitches will not change because it's defined by these two legs of the stitch and the thickness of your yarn. So the diameter of these loops here, that will change, but the bridge here, no matter if I knit with 4mm needles or 2mm needles, this gap here will not change, at least not immediately. So I cannot underline strongly enough how important it is to pick a yarn that is as similar to the original as possible. This also includes the spinning method. So if the original yarn is an 8-ply yarn, don't pick a single ply yarn with the same yardage to weight ratio, because the latter will be drastically looser than the former, and this will influence your gauge, setting aside that the 8-ply yarn will be a lot more durable than the single ply yarn, and for a lot of use cases this may be very vital. And in that context, you absolutely also need to consider that even the same yarn but different colors will appear to be thicker or thinner. Say one is black and heavily overdyed and the other is natural and undyed. And then you will notice that the natural undyed tone is a lot thinner. And this will, of course, influence your gauge and the way your fabric behaves. Think of it as the way your hair behaves after bleaching or so. Often you will notice that the individual hairs, well, they feel a lot thicker, almost like swollen or so. Absolutely also consider that different fibers will behave differently after washing. So sheep fleeces typically have a lot of crimp, so the individual hairs look like that, very wavy, to a point where one could describe it as an afro. So the knitted fabric typically springs back after washing. You might have worn it out a little bit through wear and tear, but then it springs back. Alpaca yarn does not have that much crimp, so once it's worn out, it typically stays that way. Cotton, on the other hand, depending on how it's spun and processed, may shrink dramatically after washing or wear out, or both. So you might have observed this with old t-shirts, so they typically don't look perfect anymore. So if you, especially if it's cheap cotton. So if you want to pick a different fiber, then please know that this makes the process that much more complicated. Step number 2, knitting your gauge swatch. So once you found the perfect yarn, it's time to knit your swatch. Easy as that, or is it? Well, I do have a full tutorial on how to knit a swatch here on YouTube. I'll link it to you up in here. But beyond that video, here are a couple of things you really need to consider. So previously in this video here, I showed you that gauge really factors in fractional stitches. So if your gauge swatch is 5 times 5 centimeters, and you could theoretically fit in 10.4 stitches into those 5 centimeters, but you work with 10, well, that is a difference of 4%. However, if your tension square is twice that big, meaning it's 10 times 10 centimeters, then you could theoretically fit in 20.4 stitches into those 10 centimeters, but you work with 20 stitches. Well, that is only a mistake of 2%. So as a result, the larger your swatch, the smaller your mistakes will be. Secondly, edge stitches, bind-offs, cast-offs, they all distort your fabric. So you've probably seen those scarves that were started with a cast on that is too tight, and then the fabric gets sort of wider. It happens with brioche stitch, stuff like that, very often. For a swatch, this is really not going to help you. So start with a super stretchy cast on. The Italian cast on is super easy to do, super stretchy, and then bind off with a super stretchy bind off of your choice, like the yarn over bind off, so also very easy to do. then don't use selvage stitches like slip stitch selvages or so. You don't want anything that distorts your fabric. Just knit across and then keep on all sides, keep at least 5 stitches or 5 rows of a buffer, because you want to knit in the center and you want to keep away from everything that distorts your fabric and thus your gauge. So if you need to measure 10 centimeters, then your swatch needs to be at least 20 centimeters wide, but some would actually say it would need to be 25 times 25 centimeters. That is the size of a swatch you need to measure correctly in the center without any distortions. Next, if your project is flat, then your swatch needs to be flat. And if your project is in the round, well, then it figures that your swatch should be in the round, because after all knitters have a different knit and purl tension. So if you knit stockinette stitch in the round, like for this sweater or so, then you never have to purl a single stitch. Thus your gauge will be different, especially your row gauge. However, I typically do not recommend knitting swatches in the round, and here's why. Because if you knit a small diameter project in the round, meaning you have to switch between needles frequently, aka you frequently break your rhythm, then your gauge will be different compared to a sweater like this one, knitted in the round in one continuous round, where, or magic loop, but you have 100 or 200 stitches per needle. Then you will knit with a completely different rhythm, you will be a lot more relaxed. So your small diameter swatch is just as worthless, and if you ask me, you might as well knit it flat. There will be no major difference, except you are some knitting genius, or your round swatches are actually almost as big as your project. So then I would say start knitting your project right away, and maybe you are right, and maybe you have to unravel. Then we also really need to talk about knitting techniques. It's very important that you use your knitting needles as your gauge. Your knitting needles are your gauge. So when you knit, try to slide a stitch that you want to knit to the very tip of your knitting needle and then knit it. Don't do it further down, because you need to force 2 knitting needles into one stitch, and that is going to enlarge it, whereas here at the front you are just forcing 2 half needles into the same stitch, so it doesn't wear it out as much. And this brings me directly to the next point or topic. So after you knitted a stitch, always tighten up while it's still on the knitting needles. Let the barrel of your knitting needle define the size of your stitch, and not your tension, your mood, or whatever. But since now that stitch is exactly as big as the barrel of your knitting needles, if you knit further down, this means suddenly you need to fit in twice that much, wood in this case, into one stitch. So this stitch automatically has to steal yarn from the adjacent stitches, and that's gonna look sloppy. And then here again, for this stitch, it's gonna be the same. So you're constantly redistributing yarn and stitches, while if you knit close to the tip, tighten up, close to the tip, tighten up, your knitting needle is doing that job and not your tension. And then the third issue is, of course, you should try to keep your knitting needles or the tips as close as possible, and not, very far apart like this. I mean, you can absolutely do that, but if you do that, that distance here will influence your stitch gauge, and if you keep it very close, then here these 2 legs will define your stitch gauge. If you constantly do it like that, then depending on how far your needles are apart, your stitch gauge will actually change, because you are enlarging that gap here of the row below, kind of like when you do it stretch out your fabric like so. Now, I am aware that you will not be able to switch your knitting style on a whim. This is a long-term project. However, by knitting in such a controlled way, where the thickness of your yarn and the needle size defines the size of your stitches and not your tension, you can create reproducible results. Your knitting needles are not only a tool to pull yarn through stitches, your knitting needle is your gauge, but you also have to use it as such. If you don't, then you will see big deviations depending on your mood, how relaxed, how stressed you are, and so on. You will still see this if you knit like the way I show you, but the deviations will be a lot smaller. Now, important, you also have to know that the vast majority of all designers does not knit like this either. However, this will be able to explain another margin for error, because you shall never know if the designer is a tight or a loose knitter, and even if you do, how do you define a tight or a loose knitter in the first place? So typically, when you cannot obtain a row gauge despite using the exact same yarn and the exact same needle size as the designer, the culprit is typically a different knitting style. Step number 3. Block and wash your swatch. So once you finish knitting your swatch, you have to treat it the exact same way you will treat your finished garment. So will you toss your sweaters, hats, socks or so into the washing machine? Do the same with your swatch. Will you hand wash? Do the same with your swatch. Will you carefully sprinkle morning dew on it under a full moon wearing fake elven ears? Well, then do the same with your swatch. You get the idea. Next, you need to block your swatch, and here is my all-important tip. So you need to block your swatch until it creates the fabric you want to see in your finished project. So secure one side loosely with a couple of pins, and then carefully stretch it in the other direction until you say, okay, this here looks nice. This is how I want my project to look. Now, very important, you always have to stretch a little bit. I mean, you could condense your swatch like this and it might stay put after blocking, depending on your fiber. However, as soon as you wear it, it would wear out, except you use starch. And, last time I checked, we are not living in the 17th or 18th century anymore, and I doubt a lot of young people know what starching is. So stretch it out a little bit, secure it loosely here with a couple of pins, and then do the same here in the other direction. Just use a couple of pins and then stretch it out in this direction until you say, okay, this looks nice. And once you approximated that shape, you can use more pins to secure it all the way around until here in the center. This is the fabric you want to see. Once your swatch is dry, you can measure it. Before, some people will simulate wear and tear. So some put their swatch in the pocket of their jeans or so, or simply carry it along for a day or two. Others will carefully weigh down the swatch. You could attach little pins here, or rather these clippy stitch markers, and weigh it down like that and let it hang out for a day. Personally speaking, I am a little bit hesitant. Typically, that does not really tell you a lot, because stretching typically happens when force is applied. So if you wear a sweater like this one here, typically, so this neckline is rather tight. It is actually, there was a lot of negative ease here. It's actually smaller than my head. I mean, that's the way it should look. So whenever I put on this sweater, I need to squeeze it past my nose and so on. So I pull it like that, or with a tight sweater like that. The first sleeve is typically easy, but when you try to weasel the second arm through the second sleeve, typically you need to stretch it out like that. So if you really want to simulate wear and tear, then you actually have to do things like that with your swatch. Or say you have a cotton sweater in 3XL or so, and then you wash it, and then it's all heavy, and then you put it on a hanger. Suddenly the sweater will go like that. that is the actual wear and tear that is distorting your fabric, and not, you know, carrying it around for a week in your pocket or putting it under the under the blanket on your couch, things like that. This can tell you a lot about how durable the yarn is. Make no mistake, if you're afraid it's pilling, it's felting or so, then putting the swatch in your pocket can tell you a lot. But wear and tear, how things stretch out, then you really need to apply force. When it comes to measuring your swatch, you have to realize that you are no knitting machine. So your stitches will never be 100% uniform. So as a result, you have to measure in multiple different spots. And first of all, you should always measure here in the center of your swatch and never close to any of those edges, because your cast on, your bind off, and your edge stitches will distort your fabric. See here, this is stockinette stitch, it is rolling in a little bit. This is going to distort your gauge. You only want to concentrate here on the very center. And then, you know, maybe measure once here, count 10 centimeters, then maybe here another 10 centimeters or 4 inches, whatever you want to use, and then another 10 centimeters or 4 inches here. Then you have three numbers, like 14 stitches, and 15 stitches, and then you use the mean value, and of course you have to do the exact same here vertically as well. So maybe measure 10 centimeters here, another 10 centimeters here, and another 10 centimeters here. And that is another reason why your swatch needs to be sizable and, you know, not such a tiny little piece. Because if you have such a tiny little swatch, how would you be able to measure in a couple of different spots? But only by measuring in a couple of different spots, you can account for the fact that your stitches are not uniform, that your gauge might change a little bit depending on your mood, and so on. Step number 5, getting gauge. So now that we covered the basics, the fundament, we come to the juiciest bit of this video, because often you will notice that you knitted your swatch diligently, washed it, blocked it, measured it, and you still cannot get gauge. Sometimes it's only the row gauge or just the stitch gauge, but sometimes both. So how do you proceed from there? Now, I want to show you some very simple math. Let's revisit the ideal row gauge again. So the height of a stitch is defined by the diameter of the needle plus the thickness of the yarn. Say you are working with 4.5 millimeter needles and the yarn is 2.5 millimeters thick. This would be your average DK weight yarn and needle combination. So this means each stitch is around about 7 millimeters high, and this would result in a row gauge of 14.3 stitches per 10 centimeters. If you go up a needle size to 5 millimeters, the row gauge would be 13.3 stitches, and if you go down a needle size to 4 millimeters, the row gauge would be 15.4 stitches. So roundabout, each needle size nets me an increase of roughly, or decrease of 1 stitch. Now obviously you will still have to knit a swatch. This simple calculation will not be able to replace that. However, it hopefully will prevent you from knitting 3 or 4 swatches you didn't need to knit to begin with, simply because now you know, okay, I actually need to go up 2 needle sizes and give that a try. If you are only off a little bit, say not even a full stitch, but maybe 5 millimeters or so, then kindly remember the following. So first of all, not all needles have the exact same diameter. So they might be sold as 3 millimeters, it might be written on the stock, but if you actually measure them, then you will notice that they are actually a tiny, often, not all brands, but often, they are a tiny little bit off. So sometimes changing the needle brand, say from Chagu to Haya or Knit Pro to Like or whatever, no, that won't make a difference from Like to Adi, then this can introduce small change. And on top of that, some needles are slicker than others. After every stitch you are supposed to pull tight, but bamboo, for example, offers a lot more resistance, and this means it will influence your gauge, and this can have 2 effects. So because there is so much resistance, you need to pull harder to overcome that resistance, and especially beginners will notice that they actually knit a lot tighter with bamboo as opposed to say stainless steel, whereas for experienced knitters it's typically the opposite effect, because they always pull tight with the same force, so they will, and then the resistance works against them, and then they will notice that their fabric ends up a little bit looser. But the key message here is, by changing the needle material, you can also introduce small changes. Now, when you knit your swatch, always remember you can add yarn overs or purl stitches or something like that in the first row to indicate your row, the needle size you used, because you might end up knitting 2 or sometimes 3 swatches and then you can't remember which was what. And if you have like a yarn over for each needle size, say you are knitting with size 5 and then you add 5 yarn overs in the first row or 5 purl stitches, and then you know exactly which needle size you use. Some people also do knots in the cast on or bind of tail. All these methods work. Just find a system so you can easily pinpoint, okay, this swatch was knitted with 3mm needles and this was the one with 3.5. Important, if you notice that only your row gauge or your stitch gauge is off, then say the gauge is 12 stitches times 18 rows, so you get those 12 stitches but you only have 17 or 16 rows, then going up or down a needle size will not be able to change anything. You could try a different yarn or a different needle brand or material, but even that typically will not change a lot. Remember, the designer might be a tight knitter where you are a loose knitter. The designer might have had a fractional stitch they didn't count, and then they might have blocked their swatch differently, and you have absolutely no way of knowing what they did. That is why I recommend adjusting the actual pattern, and this is actually something you will have to do regardless of if you got gauge or not, because now you actually need to do some real math. And if you want to knit a complex pattern like a sweater, there is no way around it, at least not if you want the perfect fit. And the pattern actually, or a good pattern, should come with schematics and measurements. So maybe it says size L has a bust size of 10 centimeters and there is a 10 centimeters of negative ease. So this means your actual fabric would be just 90 centimeters wide, but your bust size should be 100 centimeters. Then absolutely counter check. So don't pick size L because you are always an L over, you have always been an L. Check your bust size. Next, measure a sweater that you own and you feel like this fits well, and counter check. What's the best measurement of that sweater? Is it also 90 centimeters or is it 100 or maybe 110? If it's the same, go ahead. If not, then maybe pick a different size, because after all, preferences differ and the designer cannot really anticipate it, because one person's oversized fit is another person's standard fit, and the designer, this is all arbitrary, and this is why you really need to check sizes. With that out of the way, you should consider confirming the designer's calculations. Say you measured a swatch that is 10 by 10 centimeters and your stitch gauge is 15 stitches. The bust circumference is given as 110 centimeters, then simply divide those 110 centimeters with your swatch size. So that's 11. And then multiply that with those 15 stitches, so 165 stitches. And then counter check. Go through the pattern. How many stitches does the pattern say you should have in those rows? Also 156 stitches or more or less. Then find is there a reason for that? And if not, well, maybe there's something wrong with the pattern, and obviously you can do the exact same for cast on, bind offs, colors, and so on. There are many amazing patterns out there, and there are some that have not been tech edited and or test knitted, and they contain errors, and it takes 5 minutes to confirm that, and those 5 minutes will save you so much time, because if you knit a whole sweater, spend 40, 60, 80 hours to knit a sweater only to find out it's too large, well, I think those 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, and this simple calculation is just worth the investment. Now, of course, if your pattern or portions of the pattern rely on negative ease, you have to account for that as well. But then typically the pattern should say, okay, this pattern works with 5% negative ease, or 5 centimeters, 2 inches, whatever. Sometimes if you do the calculations, there might be a slight difference in the stitch count, so the repeat can fit in. Say it's a complex lace pattern or cables come to mind, then the designer has to work with certain multiples to make it work. But if it's off 5, 6, 10 stitches, then I would definitely investigate and check, okay, why is this off? Why is there? Because this will translate to 3, 4, 5 centimeters of positive ease, and that is something you will notice. And this brings me directly to my next point, the point that is perhaps the most important one here in this video, and some of you have been waiting for. You get stitch gauge, but your row gauge is off. What do? Well, in these cases, you will have to adjust the pattern yourself. And this requires a little deep dive, because in essence, you either have to cast on more stitches or knit more rows. So if you get stitch gauge, you can use the cast on recommendations of the designer and the increase and decrease recommendations. However, you will have to knit more rows or less rows because your row gauge is off. However, if you get the row gauge, this means you can stick to the row count or round count of the designer. However, you might have to cast on more stitches. What you need to do depends on the project. So, say you have a complicated color work project like this sweater here, then typically those patterns are optimized and the sizes are optimized. So the decrease lines here along the raglan line, or if there are seams here below the sleeves or so, they work out and look nice. So if you cast on more stitches, you are going to wreck the design. So in these cases, it's better to get stitch gauge and just knit more or less rows. However, if you have an intricate intarsia pattern or so, well, if you knit more rows, then you are going to distort the design, and that might not look nice. However, here on the margins, if you have 3, 4, 5 more stitches, it will not matter. But you have to make that decision. Take a look at the pattern and ask yourself, will it matter if I cast on more stitches? Will it change the design or keep on the margin? Or will it be better to knit more rows? And then, if it's better to knit more rows, then try to get stitch gauge and adjust the row gauge or the row calculation. If it's better to keep the rows, then try to get row gauge and adjust the cast on. So this basically means you might have to knit another swatch so you get the gauge that actually matters. So here's an example. Suppose the pattern says the row gauge is 14, or it has to be 14, but whatever you try, you always get 16. The sweater, the pattern should give you that information, has 200 rows or rounds, and then you simply divide those 200 rows or rounds by 40. The result would be 14.3 rows. And then you multiply that with the difference. So 16 minus 14, that's 2. So in total, you would have to knit 28 more rows to achieve the same length. So you will have to sprinkle these additional rows evenly across your pattern wherever they make sense. Specifically also where you increase, but you do not increase more often. That would change the circumference. But say the designer here for the raglan increases, the designer keeps increases or decreases every 2 rows. Then you will have some instances where you increase in every 3rd row. Say you increase 6 times in every 2nd row, and then the 7th time you keep 3 rows in between, things like that. You really have to do the math, because here's the deal. You might have gotten gauge, you have confirmed your fit, you've done your homework, you knit your sweater, and then it still doesn't fit. And this happens remarkably often. So ahead of this video, I asked my patrons, well, I'm recording this video and get engaged. Do you have any questions? And I actually received quite a couple of questions from people who said, well, I always get engaged and then still things don't fit. And I want you to understand, this is not a you problem. It's not, you are not the problem. At the end of the day, swatches like this one here are artificial constructs. It's a bit like learning how to swim in a heated indoor pool and then facing the rough waves of the North Atlantic coast the first time. They're worlds of a difference. So if you ask me, spending hours upon hours on perfecting your swatch, that's a waste of time. I mean, I know some people, they knit Fair Isle swatches in the round, and I'm like, okay, I would never do that. I personally just knit little swatches so I can take a rough guess. Then I cast on, and once I knitted 10 or 15 centimeters, 20, 30 rows, then I try things on and counter check. And even if I notice, well, things don't fit, I will then have my real project in front of me with my real gauge, with my real fabric, and then I can use that to adjust the pattern. Cast on more stitches, cast on fewer stitches. Maybe I notice, okay, the fabric is all loosey-goosey. Maybe I go up a needle size or go down a needle size. And yes, before you ask, you can absolutely block your work in progress as well. Slide it on some stitch marker or a spare cable, keep the yarn attached, and then dunk it in the sink and block it the regular way. I personally feel that getting gauge is an illusion. Knitting does not work that way. For me, it's gauge is a first hint, but the rest has to be adjusted on the go. The gauge swatch can tell you so many things. Does the pattern look good? Does the yarn look nice? Do I need to create a denser fabric? Things like that. How does it behave after washing? Does it bloom? Does it felt? Does it pill? Things like that. But for getting gauge, for adjusting the fit, a gauge swatch, a tension square, is always just the very first step. The rest has to be done on the go. As I said in the beginning of this video, there are just so many variables that are not even written in the pattern, or there are no standards. There are so many sources for errors. And if you just rely on the swatch, then I feel one could almost say you have not understood knitting at all. This is a nice tool, but it has limits and you need to understand them. So try things on and adjust things from there, because this is where the magic happens. Before I go on, a quick little reminder, consider supporting me on Patreon. Shooting a video like this one takes a lot of time and effort, and without the financial support of my patrons, I would not be in a position to do that. So if you want to ensure that I can create more videos like this one here, videos that go way beyond what you find even in most knitting books and in some knitting courses, then please go to patreon.com and subscribe. Even if it's just for a month or so, you can cancel any time. I want to finish this video with one last important little section. So when you are designing your own patterns, or you are altering existing patterns in a major way, I recommend approaching gauge differently. As I said, the way we record gauge and try to make it fit into little silly squares of 10 centimeters or 4 inches is fundamentally flawed, because it always ignores the issue with fractional stitches and blocking. It just doesn't work. So when you draft your own patterns, I invite you to measure stitches instead. So you take your swatch, and instead of counting how many stitches fit into this silly little square here, you just count 10 stitches, or 20 or 15, whatever, depending on your gauge. So here I start here measuring here at the very beginning of one stitch here, and then I count 10 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 stitches here, that 10 stitch, so that would be, I don't know, 5.5, 5.4 centimeters. That's how wide 10 stitches are. And then I, of course, do the same here in a couple of different spots, and of course also vertically. Use the mean value, and that is the base for my gauge, the base for my calculations. And a simple division will tell you that each stitch is 0.57 centimeters wide. And if your bust circumference is 100 centimeters, then you divide that yet again, and you know that you need 175.4 stitches. And this eliminates the issue with the traditional method, because if you follow that example and measure 10 centimeters instead, you would have 17.5 stitches. What would you do? Round up or round down? If you round down, then you cast on 180 stitches instead of 175. That's a difference of 2.85 centimeters. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a difference of 2.5%. On top of that, you might have overstretched your swatch a little bit. When you measured your bust, the tape measure might not have been level all the way around, and your measurement might be 1 or 2% off. Not a lot, but you know, with 110 centimeters, that is another 1 or 2 centimeters. Now, if you are lucky, everything, it all cancels itself out. But if you are unlucky, everything stacks upon each other, and then you end up with one size larger, despite on paper having done everything correctly. And this brings me to my second piece of advice. For fitted garments that rely on negative ease, always measure while the swatch is still on the blocking mat. So stretch your swatch until you feel the stitches look nice, and then measure right there, and then of course in 3 different positions, and then use the mean value. Do so after washing, because some yarns bloom, others shrink, some bleed out, etc. So washing is still important. And then measure once dry. So socks come to mind, or gloves, or hats, or something like that. All these projects that rely on negative ease, where as you wear the project, the fabric is here under tension. I mean, if you wear a shawl or so, typically there is no tension involved. The fabric is relaxed. For your socks, your cuffs around your calf, there is tension involved. And by measuring here while still on the blocking mat, you can, I feel this is the best way to approximate your gauge and the kind of fabric you want to see in your finished project, instead of relying on, calculate 10 or 15% negative ease. Negative ease will depend on your fiber and how you block it. So, that's just guesswork. Here you get what you see. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope I was able to show you the limits of getting gauge and how you really need to work with it. If you still have any questions, then please ask them in the comments below. For example, I haven't really shown you here in this video how to adjust the pattern, because this obviously would be beyond the scope of this video. But if you would like to see me showing you how to really adjust the pattern, then please also comment below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed watching, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.